Sometimes a man will sacrifice everything for a chance to start over. Ramon had spent his last dollar on a rundown farm, hoping it would be the fresh beginning he desperately needed. The seller only asked one thing: keep the barn locked. For weeks, Ramon kept his word, focusing on fixing the farmhouse and clearing the land. But the sounds coming from inside that barn grew louder, scraping metal, muffled cries, something moving in the darkness. One afternoon, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He broke the lock and stepped inside. What he found beneath the old tarps wasn't farming equipment. It was something that made his hands shake, something tied to a secret the whole county had buried years ago. What was hidden in that barn? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched beneath worn tires as Ramon Salazar's truck rolled to a stop in front of what would now be called home. He sat there for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, taking in the sight before him. The farmhouse stood weathered but sturdy, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood like old skin. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and several shutters hung at odd angles, but the roof looked sound. That was something, at least. Beside him in the passenger seat, his son Paulo stirred from sleep, rubbing his eyes with small fists. The boy was 8 years old, all knees and elbows, with his mother's dark eyes and Ramon's stubborn chin. "We're here?" Paulo's voice was thick with sleep and uncertainty. "We're here, mijo." Ramon forced brightness into his tone that he didn't quite feel. "Our new home." Paulo peered through the windshield at the house, then beyond it to the fields that stretched toward a line of trees in the distance. And there off to the right stood the barn. It was larger than the house, built from dark wood that had weathered to almost black in places. Even from here, Ramon could see the massive padlock hanging from the doors. They climbed out of the truck into the late April afternoon. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, tinged with earth and growing things. No exhaust fumes, no garbage rotting in alleys, no shouting neighbors. Just wind moving through grass and the distant call of a bird Ramon couldn't identify. The property had cost him everything, literally everything. The last of his savings, scraped together from 3 years of working double shifts at the bottling plant before it closed. The small life insurance policy from Sylvia's death 2 years ago, money he'd sworn to save for Paulo's education. Even the truck would need to be sold soon, traded for something cheaper that would leave a few $100s for food and repairs. But it was theirs. 20 acres of possibility, a roof over their heads, and the promise, however fragile, of a fresh start. Ramon had found the listing by accident, scrolling through property sites late one night in their cramped apartment while Paulo slept on the couch. The price had seemed impossible, a mistake surely. A farmhouse, barn, and 20 acres for less than a decent used car. He'd called the number immediately despite the hour. The man who answered had a voice like gravel and old wood. Hadley Crane, he'd said. He'd owned the property for 50 years, inherited it from his father before that. Now he was moving to Arizona to be near his daughter, wanted the place to go to someone who'd appreciate it. Not some developer who'd tear it down for condos. They'd met 3 days later. Mr. Crane was tall and gaunt, somewhere in his 80s, with hands that trembled slightly as he handed Ramon the keys. They'd walked the property together, Ramon, Paulo, and the old man. Mr. Crane had shown them the house room by room, pointing out which floorboards were loose, which windows stuck, where the water heater tended to leak. But when they approached the barn, Mr. Crane had stopped. His whole demeanor shifted, his jaw tightening. "The barn stays locked," he'd said, his voice firm despite its quaver. "That's the only condition of the sale. You can have the house, the land, everything else. But the barn—" He'd looked Ramon straight in the eye. "The barn stays locked. You give me your word on that." Ramon had hesitated, confused. "Is there something dangerous in there? Something I should know about?" "Nothing that'll harm you, as long as you keep it locked." "You have my word on that. But I need yours in return." It had seemed like a small price for what Ramon was getting. An old man's superstition, maybe, or some quirky sentiment about whatever he'd stored inside. Ramon had given his word. Now standing in the yard, with Paulo beside him, he looked at that barn and felt a prickle of unease he couldn't quite name. "Can we go inside?" Paulo asked, meaning the house. "Yeah, let's see what we've got." The inside was better than Ramon had feared. The furniture was old but functional. A couch that sagged in the middle, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, 2 beds upstairs in small rooms with slanted ceilings. The previous owners had left dishes in the cabinets, towels in the bathroom, even sheets on the beds. Everything was clean but worn, threadbare from decades of use. Paso claimed the smaller bedroom, the one with a window overlooking the backyard. Ramon took the larger room at the front of the house. Together, they unloaded the truck. 6 boxes total containing everything they owned. Clothes, books, Paulo's collection of baseball cards, a photo album with pictures of Sylvia. Not much to show for 38 years of life, but it was enough. As evening settled in, they made sandwiches from the groceries Ramon had bought on the drive. They ate on the porch steps, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Ramon had forgotten existed. "It's quiet," Paulo observed. "That's good, isn't it?" The boy considered this. "I guess. Just different," Ramon understood. In the city, silence meant danger, empty streets, abandoned buildings, moments before something bad happened. Here, silence was simply peace. After Paulo went to bed, Ramon sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. Crickets sang their evening chorus. Somewhere an owl called, low and mournful. The farmhouse settled around him with creaks and sighs, the sounds of old wood breathing. His gaze kept drifting to the barn. In the darkness, it was just a looming shape against the stars. He thought about Mr. Crane's intensity, the way the old man's voice had sharpened when talking about keeping it locked. What could possibly be in there that required such secrecy? Old equipment, probably. Maybe hazardous materials that should have been disposed of properly. Or perhaps just personal belongings the old man wasn't ready to part with. Ramon reminded himself it wasn't his concern. He'd given his word, and his word meant something. The barn could stay locked forever for all he cared. He had enough to worry about. Finding work in town, getting Paulo enrolled in school, learning how to coax vegetables from soil that hadn't been tended in who knew how long. A sound drifted across the yard, faint, barely audible over the crickets. A scraping like metal on metal. Ramon sat forward, listening. There it was again, something moving inside the barn. Probably rats, he told himself. Or raccoons. Old buildings were full of animals looking for shelter, but the sound came again, rhythmic now, deliberate, and beneath it, something else. Something that might have been a voice, too distant to make out words. Ramon stood, took a step toward the barn, then stopped himself. His imagination, surely. The wind moving through gaps in the wood. The building settling. He went inside, locked the door, and climbed the stairs to his room. Through the window, he could see the barn silhouetted against the night sky. The padlock glinted in the moonlight. Ramon pulled the curtain closed and told himself everything was fine. But sleep was a long time coming. And even when it arrived, it was thin and restless, threaded through with dreams of locked doors and voices calling from the dark. 3 weeks passed in a blur of repair work and adjustment. Ramon fixed the sagging porch, replaced broken windows, and patched holes in the walls where mice had made highways. Paulo helped when he could, holding tools and fetching supplies. But mostly he explored the property, discovering treasures in the overgrown fields, rusted farm equipment, a creek bed that still held water after rain, a family of rabbits living beneath an old shed. Ramon found work at a lumber yard in Millerton, the small town 5 miles down the road. The pay was modest but steady, enough to buy groceries and set a little aside each week. The manager, a gruff man named Stan, had looked at Ramon's calloused hands and hired him on the spot. "Anyone who knows real work is welcome here," he'd said, but the sounds from the barn continued. At first, Ramon had convinced himself they were nothing. Wind, animals, the natural noises of an old structure. Yet as the days passed, the sounds grew more distinct. Metal scraping against metal, always in the same rhythm. A thumping that came in patterns, like someone tapping out a message. And once, late at night when he'd gone outside to check on a shutter that was banging in the wind, he'd heard something that stopped him cold. A voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Paolo had mentioned it too, though Ramon had tried to dismiss his concerns. "I heard people talking out there," the boy had said one morning over breakfast. "In the barn? It's just the wind, mijo. Old buildings make strange sounds." But Paolo's expression had been skeptical, and Ramon couldn't blame him. He was hearing the same things. On a Thursday afternoon, Ramon came home from work to find Paolo sitting on the porch steps, staring at the barn with an intensity that made Ramon's stomach tighten. "What's wrong?" Paolo didn't look away from the barn. "I heard crying. A kid, I think. Someone crying in there." Ramon's first instinct was to dismiss it again, but the certainty in his son's voice stopped him. Instead, he walked across the yard to the barn, Paolo trailing behind him. Up close, the structure was even more imposing. The wood was rough beneath his palm, weathered by decades of sun and rain. The padlock hung heavy and rusted, but still secure. Ramon pressed his ear to the door. For a long moment, he heard nothing but his own breathing. Then there, a sound, faint but definite. "Movement from inside, hello," he called out. His voice sounded small against the massive doors. "Is someone in there?" Silence. Then more movement, closer now. The scraping sound again. "Dad?" Paolo's voice was thin with fear. Ramon stepped back, his mind racing. If someone was inside, how had they gotten there? The padlock was intact. There were no other doors, no windows large enough for a person to climb through. Unless they'd been locked in, but that was impossible. Mr. Crane wouldn't have. He thought about the old man's intensity, the way he'd insisted on that single condition. "The barn stays locked." Ramon knelt down, examining the base of the door. That's when he saw it, wedged in a crack between the door and the frame, a corner of something white. "Paper or maybe cardboard." He worked it free carefully, pulling it out inch by inch until it came loose. It was a photograph. Old water damaged, the emulsion cracked and peeling. The image showed a woman, maybe in her 30s, standing beside a young boy. They were in front of a house. This house, Ramon realized, though it looked better maintained in the photo. The woman had a gentle smile, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder. But their faces were partly obscured by dark spots of mold, and the edges of the photo were torn, as if it had been ripped from a larger picture. Paolo peered at it over his shoulder. "Who are they?" "I don't know," but even as he said it, Ramon felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't just an old man's eccentricity. Something real was happening here, something that involved real people. The photograph felt heavy in his hand, weighted with stories he didn't yet know. The next morning, Ramon drove to the Millerton Public Library before work. It was a small building, red brick with white trim, sitting on the corner of Main Street. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A few elderly patrons sat reading newspapers in worn leather chairs. The librarian at the desk was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a name tag that read Percy Dutton. He looked up from his computer as Ramon approached. "Help you find something?" "I'm looking for information about a property." "The old Crane place, out on County Road 14. Mr. Dutton's fingers paused over his keyboard. Something flickered across his face, recognition or maybe concern. "Oh, the Crane property? I just bought it. Trying to learn some of the history." The librarian's expression became carefully neutral. "Well, the Cranes have been in the area for generations. What specifically are you interested in? Anything unusual? Any, I don't know, incidents or events connected to the property?" Mr. Dutton stood, moving toward a filing cabinet with an air of reluctance. "We keep local newspaper archives, going back about 70 years on microfilm, further than that in bound volumes." He pulled open a drawer, fingers walking through files. "Can't say I recall anything particular about the Crane place. It's always been a quiet property," but his tone suggested otherwise. There was something he wasn't saying. Ramon spent an hour scrolling through old newspapers, searching for any mention of the Crane family or the property. Most of what he found was mundane, mentions in church bulletins, a notice about Hadley's father serving on the school board. an obituary for Hadley's mother from 1982. Then, in a paper from September 1978, he found something that made him lean closer to the screen. Local tragedy claims. 2 lives. A house fire on the evening of September 12th claimed the lives of Constance Brenner, 34, and her son Vincent, 7. The fire, which occurred at the family's residence on Maple Street, was ruled accidental by fire investigators. Mrs. Brenner was a school teacher at Millerton Elementary. She is survived by her brother Hadley Crane and several cousins. A memorial service will be held on Saturday. Ramon read the article 3 times. Constance Brenner, Hadley Crane's sister. He looked at the photograph he'd found at the barn, now tucked in his jacket pocket. Could this be her? The age seemed about right, but if she died in 1978, why did he have a photo that seemed to have been recently wedged in the barn door? He printed the article and thanked Mr. Dutton, who watched him leave with an expression Ramon couldn't quite read. As he walked to his truck, Ramon pulled out his phone and did a quick search for Constance Brenner and Vincent Brenner. A few results came up: ancestry sites, old census records. Nothing recent. No social media profiles, no current addresses. Dead for 47 years, according to the official record. So why did Ramon feel so certain that someone was alive inside that barn? That night after Paolo was asleep, the sounds came again. Louder this time, more insistent. The scraping, the thumping, and underneath it all, something that sounded heartbreakingly like sobbing. Ramon stood at his bedroom window, looking down at the barn. The padlock gleamed in the moonlight. He thought about his promise to Mr. Crane, but he also thought about Paolo saying he'd heard a child crying. He went downstairs, past Paolo's room where his son slept soundly, and out to the shed behind the house. Inside, among the tools he'd accumulated, he found what he was looking for, a pair of bolt cutters. Ramon carried them back to the house and set them by the door. He didn't go to the barn, not yet. But the bolt cutters sat there, waiting, while Ramon lay awake and listened to the sounds drifting across the yard, sounds that could no longer be ignored, no longer be explained away as wind or animals or imagination. Someone was in that barn, and tomorrow Ramon was going to find out who. Dawn came cold and grey, the sun hidden behind a blanket of clouds that promised rain. Ramon had barely slept, his mind churning through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the barn emerge from the darkness as light slowly filled the sky. Paolo came downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah, mijo. Just tired." Ramon set down his mug. "Listen, I need you to stay inside today. Don't go near the barn, understand?" Paolo's eyes widened. "You're going to open it. I need to check something. But I want you inside, safe. Promise me." The boy nodded slowly. "Promise." Ramon waited until Paolo was settled with breakfast and a book, then picked up the bolt cutters and walked across the dewy grass toward the barn. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the knowledge that he was about to break his word, something he'd taught Paolo never to do. But what kind of man would he be if he ignored what might be someone in need? The padlock was old, the metal pitted with rust but still solid. Ramon positioned the bolt cutters around the shackle, took a breath, and squeezed. The metal resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed across the property. The lock fell to the ground with a heavy thud. For a moment, Ramon just stood there, his hands trembling slightly. Then he grasped the door handle and pulled. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in who knew how long. Sunlight spilled into the barn's interior, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. The smell hit him first: musty hay, old wood, and something else. Something lived in. Ramon stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside, the ceiling soaring overhead with exposed beams. Hay bales were stacked along one wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. Old farm equipment sat rusting in corners, a plow, some kind of harvester. Tools whose purposes Ramon couldn't identify. It looked like any old barn, abandoned, empty. Then he saw the desk. It sat near the entrance, a simple wooden desk that looked out of place among the agricultural debris. On its surface lay a leather-bound journal, a pen resting in the crease between open pages. Ramon approached slowly, his heart hammering. The journal was old but not ancient, the leather still supple, not cracked with age. He picked it up carefully and read the open page. June 15th, 2024. I don't know how much longer I can do this. My hands shake more every day. The stairs to the loft are getting harder to manage. I've made arrangements, left instructions with Sterling, but I worry it won't be enough. What if something happens to me and no one knows? What if they're found? After all these years of keeping them safe, I can't let it end badly. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Mr. Crane's handwriting, Ramon was certain. He flipped back through the pages, reading entries that went back years. Decades even. March 3rd, 2019. Vincent asked about the outside world again today. He's 47 years old and has spent most of his life in this barn. What have I done? But the alternative was worse, is worse. The Thorns still run this county like their personal kingdom. As long as Preston Jr. breathes, they're not safe. Ramon's mind reeled. Vincent, the boy from the photograph? Alive, living in this barn for 40 years? September 12th, 1978. Today we buried empty caskets. Constance cried the whole time, watching her own funeral from my truck, parked on the hill overlooking the cemetery. Vincent doesn't understand why he can't go home, why everyone thinks he's dead. He's only 7. How do you explain to a child that his father was murdered and powerful people want him and his mother dead too? Ramon felt sick. He lowered the journal, looking around the barn with new eyes. If people had been living here, where? Then he saw it. At the back of the barn, partially hidden behind stacked hay bales, was another door. Newer than the barn itself, solid wood with a heavy lock. Not rusted, like the exterior padlock, but maintained, functional. The sounds came from behind that door. Scraping, movement, and now that he was inside, he could hear something else. Breathing. Someone was behind that door, and they knew he was here. Hello? Ramon's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. Is someone there? Silence. Then a voice, so faint he almost missed it. Please. Just that one word, but it contained a universe of desperation. Ramon rushed to the door, testing the lock. It was solid, newer than anything else in the barn. He didn't have the bolt cutters. He'd left them outside by the main door. I'm going to get something to open this, he called through the wood. Just hold on. Wait. The voice again, stronger now. A woman's voice, elderly and hoarse. Who are you? My name is Ramon Salazar. I bought this property from Mr. Crane. A sharp intake of breath from the other side. Hadley sold the farm about a month ago. He moved to Arizona. A sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, Ramon couldn't tell. He left us. Oh God, he finally left us. Are you Constance? A long pause. How do you know that name? I found a newspaper article about a fire in 1978. You were supposed to have died. Yes, we were supposed to have died. Her voice broke. We've been locked in here since Hadley left. 3 weeks, maybe 4. We've been drinking water from the bathroom tap, but the food ran out days ago. We tried to make noise, hoping someone would hear, but we? Ramon pressed his palm against the door. Who's with you? My son, Vincent. He's sick. The stress, the hunger. Please, you have to help us. Ramon was already moving, running back to where he'd dropped the bolt cutters. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing. People locked in a barn for weeks, starving. A woman who'd been dead for 47 years. A son who'd spent his entire life hidden away. He grabbed the bolt cutters and returned to the interior door, positioning them around the lock. This one was harder, newer metal that resisted. He squeezed with all his strength, muscles straining. The lock held. He adjusted his grip, braced his feet, and tried again. The lock snapped. Ramon pulled the door open and stepped back, unsure what to expect. The woman who emerged made him catch his breath. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, rail-thin and pale. Her grey hair hung in a long braid down her back. She wore old clothes that hung loosely on her frame, a cardigan over a simple dress, both faded and worn. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, taking in Ramon with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Behind her, the space beyond the door was revealed, not a storage room but a living space. A small apartment carved out of the barn's interior. He could see a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom door, and on the bed, a man lay motionless. "Help him," Constance said, her voice breaking. "Please help my son." Ramon moved past her into the room. The man on the bed was middle-aged, perhaps late 40s, with the same dark hair as the woman, though his was shot through with grey. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones, and his breathing was shallow and laboured. "How long has he been like this?" 2 days. Maybe 3. He stopped eating first, said I should have what little food was left. He's always been—" her voice caught. "He's always tried to protect me." Ramon pulled out his phone. No signal this deep in the barn. "I need to get him to a hospital. Can he walk?" "I don't think so." Ramon bent down, slipping his arms under the man. Vincent, he reminded himself. This was Vincent Brenner, supposedly dead for 47 years. The man weighed almost nothing, felt fragile as old paper in Ramon's arms. "Come on," Ramon said to Constance. "Let's get you both out of here." He carried Vincent toward the barn door, Constance following on unsteady legs. The sunlight hit them as they emerged, and both Constance and her son flinched, Vincent stirring weakly in Ramon's arms. Paula was standing on the porch, eyes wide with shock. "Dad, go inside and call 911, Ramon ordered. "Tell them we need an ambulance. Tell them—" He paused. What could Paulo possibly tell them that would make sense? "Tell them someone's collapsed and needs immediate help." Paulo disappeared inside. Ramon carried Vincent to the porch, laying him gently on the wooden planks. Constance sank down beside her son, taking his hand in both of hers. "Vincent, honey, we're outside. Can you hear me? We're outside." The man's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the light. He looked up at the sky, the cloudy, grey morning sky, and tears began running down his temples into his hair. "Mama," he whispered, "is it real?" "It's real, baby. We're free." Ramon stood back, looking at the two of them, this woman and her son who'd been ghosts for nearly 50 years, now solid and real, and desperately in need of help. He thought about the journal entries, about powerful people and murder and secrets that had been kept so long they'd become a kind of prison. And he realized that opening the barn door hadn't ended the mystery, it had only just begun. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, sirens cutting through the quiet morning. 2 paramedics rushed up the porch steps, their expressions shifting from professional efficiency to confusion as they took in the scene. An elderly woman and a middle-aged man, both severely malnourished, both looking like they hadn't seen sunlight in years. "How long have they been without food?" the younger paramedic asked as they checked Vincent's vitals. Ramon exchanged a glance with Constance. "A few weeks," he said carefully. "There was an accident. They got locked in a storage building." The paramedic's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. They loaded Vincent onto a stretcher, started an IV, and helped Constance into the ambulance. She looked back at Ramon as they prepared to close the doors. "Don't tell anyone," she said, her voice urgent despite her weakness. "Please, not yet." The doors closed before Ramon could respond. He stood in the yard with Paulo, watching the ambulance disappear down the long driveway, lights flashing, but sirens silent now. "Dad, what's happening?" Paulo's voice was small, frightened. "Who were those people?" Ramon put a hand on his son's shoulder. "I don't fully understand yet, mijo, but I think they've been in trouble for a long time, and we just helped them." He looked down at the boy. "I need you to not talk about this at school, okay? Not until we understand more." Paulo nodded, but his eyes were full of questions Ramon couldn't yet answer. After dropping Paulo at the neighbor's house, Mrs. Judith Fairholme, a widow in her 60s, who'd brought them a welcome basket the first week, Ramon drove to the clinic in Millerton. It was a small facility, more urgent care than hospital, but it was the closest medical help available. He found Constance in a private room, an IV in her arm, looking more alert than she had that morning. A doctor stood beside her bed, making notes on a tablet. "Mr. Salazar?" The doctor turned to him. I'm Dr. Pierce. You're—" He paused, clearly uncertain of the relationship. "Friend," Ramon supplied. "How is she?" "Dehydrated and malnourished, but stable. We're running some tests, making sure there's no organ damage from the prolonged starvation. Her son is in worse shape. We've transferred him to Regional Hospital in Hartsville. He needs more intensive care than we can provide here." After the doctor left, Ramon pulled a chair close to Constance's bed. "You need to tell me what's going on. All of it." Constance closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Where do I even begin?" The journal mentioned the Thorns and murder. She took a shaky breath. Preston Thorne. He is the most powerful man in this county. His family's owned half of it for 3 generations. His son runs things now. But back in 1978, it was Preston Sr. who controlled everything. What did he do? I saw him kill a man. George Mason was his business partner. They had a disagreement about some land deal. I was driving home from the school where I taught. It was late, after a parent conference. I took a back road that ran past Preston's property. She paused, swallowing hard. I saw them arguing outside Preston's barn, saw Preston pull out a gun and shoot George 3 times. Then he dragged the body inside. Ramon felt cold. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so. Not then. But I made the mistake of going to the sheriff the next morning. I was naive. I thought—" She laughed bitterly. "I thought the law would protect me. The sheriff was Preston's cousin. Within hours, Preston knew I'd seen everything." "What happened?" "My husband died 3 days later. Car accident, they called it. Brake failure on a steep hill." Her voice hardened. "My husband was a mechanic. He maintained that car religiously. There was no brake failure. I'm sorry. I was terrified. I had Vincent. He was only 7 years old. I went to my brother Hadley, told him everything. He believed me, and he came up with a plan." She looked at Ramon. "We faked our deaths. There was a real fire at my house. Hadley made sure it looked accidental. He'd gotten bodies from a medical college, claimed they were unclaimed indigents for a study. Dental records were destroyed in the fire. Preston believed we were dead, and you've been hiding here ever since." Hadley converted part of the barn into living space. It was crude at first, but over the years he improved it. Added plumbing, electricity from a generator, insulation. He brought us food, books, everything we needed. He even homeschooled Vincent through high school using correspondence courses. She shook her head. "My brother gave up his whole life to keep us safe. He never married, never had children of his own, just devoted himself to protecting us. But he left. Why would he abandon you?" "He didn't mean to." "At least, I don't think he did." Constance's voice wavered. "He was getting old. His memory was slipping. He talked about Arizona, about his daughter's invitation to move there. I think maybe he forgot about us in the end. Or maybe he thought he told someone to take care of us. But he hadn't." The horror of it settled over Ramon. Nearly 50 years of hiding, and it had almost ended with them dying of starvation. Forgotten. The journal mentioned you were keeping them safe, not just hiding. Safe from what specifically? If Preston ever learned we were alive, that I could testify about what I saw. Constance's hands twisted in the bedsheet. "He'd kill us. Or worse, he'd make it look like an accident, like my husband. The Thorns don't leave loose ends. But Preston must be dead by now. That was 47 years ago. Preston died in 1995, but his son, Preston Jr., took over everything. And Jr., she looked at Ramon directly. Jr. is worse than his father ever was. More ruthless, more careful. If he knew we existed, knew what we could reveal about his father's crimes." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Fairholme entered, her face pale and shocked. She stopped when she saw Constance, her hand going to her mouth. "Connie? Dear God, is it really you?" "Hello, Judith." Constance's smile was tired but genuine. Ramon stood. "You know each other?" "We were friends," Judith said, moving to the bedside. "Before the fire. Everyone thought you were dead." She looked at Ramon. "How is this possible?" "My brother kept us alive," Constance said softly. "Kept us hidden." Hadley knew. "All these years, and he never said—" Judith sank into the chair Ramon had vacated. He told me to watch the property after he left. Said it was important, but he wouldn't explain why. I thought he was just being sentimental about the old place. If I'd known you were in there, he was supposed to tell you, Constance said. He promised he would if anything happened to him. But I think his mind was going. He forgot. Judith covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. You were locked in there for weeks, starving, and I was just down the road. It's not your fault, Constance said firmly. Hadley's memory failed. That's all. You couldn't have known. Ramon watched this reunion, his mind working through implications. Mrs. Fairholme, you said Hadley asked you to watch the property. Did he tell anyone else? Not that I know of. Hadley was always very private about his business. Then right now, besides the three of us, who knows that Constance and Vincent are alive? The paramedics, Judith said. The doctor. Nurses at the hospital. None of them know who we really are, Constance said. To them, we're just Ramon's friends who had an accident. But if the Thorns find out, Ramon began. They'll eliminate us, Constance finished. After all this time, after everything Hadley sacrificed to keep us safe, we'll die anyway. The room fell silent. Through the window, Ramon could see Millerton's main street, the hardware store, the diner, the bank with its gleaming brass sign, Thorn Financial Services. Then we need to make sure they don't find out, Ramon said. Not until we figure out what to do. What can we do? Constance's voice was hollow. We've been dead for 47 years. We have no identification, no legal existence. Vincent spent his entire adult life in hiding. Even if we wanted to come forward, to testify about what I saw, it was so long ago. Who would believe us? Who would care? I would, Judith said quietly. I care, and so do I, Ramon added. There has to be a way to protect you, to finally make this right. But even as he said it, he wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. The Thorns had gotten away with murder for decades. They had power, money, and the entire county in their pocket. What did Ramon have? A rundown farm and a determination to do the right thing. He thought about Paolo, about the fresh start he'd promised his son. Opening that barn had pulled them into something dangerous, something that had already cost one man his life and trapped two others for half a century. But he couldn't walk away now. Wouldn't? He looked at Constance, at this woman who'd survived the impossible, and made a silent vow, whatever it took, he would help them find freedom. Real freedom. Not just another kind of cage. Vincent remained in the hospital for 3 days. Ramon visited each afternoon after work, bringing books and magazines. Trying to help this man, who'd spent 40 years isolated from the world, begin to understand how much had changed. Vincent was cautious at first, speaking in monosyllables, watching Ramon with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. But gradually, over shared meals from the hospital cafeteria and quiet conversations about nothing in particular, he began to open up. I remember the outside, Vincent said on the second day, staring out the window at the parking lot below. But it's like remembering a dream. I was 7 when we went into the barn. 7. I had friends at school, played baseball in the summer. Then one day, Mum told me we had to hide, that bad people wanted to hurt us. I didn't understand. That must have been terrifying. Uncle Hadley tried to make it okay. He brought me toys, later books, and educational materials. Built me a whole library in that barn. Vincent's voice was distant. But I never stopped wanting to leave. To see the sun whenever I wanted. To walk down a street. To just exist. Ramon thought about his own complaints over the years, about long work hours, cramped apartments, struggling to make ends meet. But he'd always had freedom, the basic human right to walk outside his door. You'll have that now, Ramon said. Whatever it takes, you'll have that. Vincent turned from the window, and Ramon saw tears on his face. I'm 47 years old, and I don't know how to be a person. I've never had a job, never paid a bill, never... His voice cracked. I've never even been on a date, never kissed anyone, never had friends except Mom and Uncle Hadley. The weight of stolen decades hung between them. You'll learn, Ramon said. It's not too late. But even as he said it, he wondered. How did someone recover from 40 years of life denied? On the 3rd day, the doctor cleared Vincent for discharge. Constance had already been released, staying at Judith's house at Ramon's suggestion. The barn apartment felt too much like a prison, and the farmhouse didn't seem appropriate given their strange circumstances. Ramon drove them both to Judith's place, a modest ranch house on the edge of Millerton. Judith had prepared a room for Vincent, filled it with clothes her late husband had left behind, toiletries, everything he might need. That evening, the four of them sat around Judith's kitchen table. Ramon, Judith, Constance, and Vincent. A half-eaten casserole sat between them, but nobody seemed hungry anymore. "We need to decide what comes next," Judith said, breaking the silence. "You can't hide forever, can't we?" Vincent's voice was bitter. "It's what we've done my whole life. The difference now is that Hadley's gone," Ramon said. "There's no infrastructure to support long-term hiding. And more importantly, you deserve better than hiding. Deserve doesn't matter if we're dead," Constance pointed out. Ramon pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a photocopy he'd made at the library. The yellowed newspaper article about George Mason's death ruled a suicide. "You said Preston Thorne killed George Mason in 1978. This is the article about Mason's death. It says he shot himself." Constance's face hardened. "That's what Preston made it look like. But I saw him pull the trigger. I saw George's face, surprised, terrified. That wasn't suicide." "The problem is proof," Judith said. "Your testimony is valuable, but it's been so long. Physical evidence is gone. Witnesses? There might be others," Vincent interrupted. Everyone turned to look at him. Uncle Hadley used to talk sometimes, when he'd had too much whiskey. He'd mention things he'd heard, things he'd learned over the years. "Preston Thorne didn't stop with George Mason." "What do you mean?" Ramon leaned forward. "There were others. People who crossed the thorns and ended up dead or ruined. Uncle Hadley kept track, I think. He had files, records." Vincent's brow furrowed. "He kept them in a safety deposit box. Said if anything ever happened to him, someone would need to know the truth." Ramon and Judith exchanged glances. "Do you know which bank?" "Hartsville. He mentioned it once. Said he used a bank outside the county because he didn't trust Millerton institutions. They're all connected to the Thorns somehow. Did he ever tell you what was in the files?" Vincent shook his head. "Just that he'd been collecting evidence for years. Documentation of crimes, patterns of corruption. He said..." Vincent's voice dropped. "He said if the truth ever came out, the Thorne family would fall. Everything they've built is rotten underneath." Constance reached across the table, taking her son's hand. "Hadley never told me about files. He must have been protecting me, thinking if I didn't know I couldn't accidentally reveal anything." "So we need to find these files," Ramon said. "If they exist, they might be exactly what we need to protect you and expose the Thorns." "There's a problem," Judith pointed out. "Safety deposit boxes require identification, authorization. We can't just walk in and demand to see Hadley's box. What about his lawyer?" Ramon asked. "Mr. Sterling, the one who handled the property sale. Wouldn't he have instructions?" "Maybe," Constance said slowly. "Hadley trusted Bernard Sterling. They'd known each other since childhood. If Hadley left instructions with anyone, it would be him." A plan began forming in Ramon's mind, fragile and uncertain, but a plan nonetheless. "Tomorrow I'll contact Sterling. See what he knows about Hadley's arrangements." "And in the meantime," Vincent asked, "in the meantime you both stay here with Judith. Stay out of sight. Don't go into town, don't talk to anyone you don't know." Ramon looked at each of them in turn. "The Thorns can't know you're alive, not yet. Not until we have enough ammunition to protect you." As Ramon drove home that night, his headlights cutting through the darkness, he thought about the strange turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been a desperate man looking for a fresh start. Now he was caught up in a decades-old conspiracy, trying to protect people he'd only just met from a family, powerful enough to have gotten away with murder for generations. He thought about Paolo, waiting at home with the neighbor watching him. His son deserved a simple life, a safe life. Ramon had brought them here seeking exactly that. Instead, he'd opened a door, literally, that led to danger and secrets and responsibilities he'd never anticipated, but he couldn't regret it. Looking at Vincent's face today, seeing the yearning for normal life in his eyes, Ramon knew he'd made the right choice. Some doors needed to be opened, no matter what promises had been made to keep them locked. The next morning, Ramon called Bernard Sterling's office. The receptionist was polite but firm. Mr. Sterling's schedule was completely booked for the next 2 weeks. "Tell him it's about Hadley Crane's property," Ramon said. "Tell him it's urgent." 10 minutes later, his phone rang. Sterling's voice was professionally cautious. "Mr. Salazar, what can I do for you?" "I need to meet with you. It's about Mr. Crane's affairs. There are some complications that have arisen." A pause. "What sort of complications?" "The kind that should be discussed in person." Another pause, longer this time. "I have an opening at 3 o'clock today. My office is on Main Street above the pharmacy. I'll be there." Ramon called Stan at the lumber yard, explained he had a family emergency and needed the afternoon off. Stan grumbled, but agreed. Ramon had been reliable, and that bought him some flexibility. At 2:30, Ramon parked on Main Street and climbed the narrow stairs beside the pharmacy to Sterling's office. The lawyer's waiting room was small but elegant, decorated with old law books and framed diplomas. Sterling himself was in his 70s, tall and thin with white hair combed back from a high forehead. He wore a 3-piece suit, despite the warmth of the day, and regarded Ramon with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Mr. Salazar, please, come in." The office was lined with file cabinets and bookshelves. Sterling gestured to a leather chair across from his desk and waited until Ramon was seated before speaking. "You said there were complications. I assume this concerns the barn." Ramon's surprise must have shown on his face because Sterling smiled slightly. "Hadley and I were friends for 60 years, Mr. Salazar. I knew about Constance and Vincent. I'm one of the few who did." He leaned back in his chair. "The question is, how did you discover them?" "They were trapped. After Mr. Crane left, they nearly starved." Sterling's face paled. "Dear God, Hadley said he told me he'd informed someone to check on them. He told Judith Fairholme to watch the property, but not why. I think his memory was failing." Yes, it was." Sterling rubbed his temples. "I should have checked myself. I knew the situation. I just thought," he looked at Ramon, "are they all right?" "Physically, they're recovering, but they're frightened. The Thorns are still a threat, yes." Sterling stood and moved to one of the file cabinets. He pulled out a folder thick with papers. "Hadley left very specific instructions with me. Instructions that were to be executed upon certain conditions being met." "What conditions?" Sterling opened the folder and removed a sealed envelope. "If Constance and Vincent ever left the barn voluntarily, or if a stranger purchased the property." He handed the envelope to Ramon. "I think it's time you read this." Ramon's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal on the envelope. Inside were several pages in Hadley Crane's shaky handwriting, dated just 3 months before he'd sold the property. He read aloud so Sterling could hear, "To whoever reads this, I pray it's someone with courage and integrity. If you're reading these words, it means my sister Constance and her son Vincent have either left the barn of their own accord, or circumstances have forced their discovery. Either way, the time for hiding is over. I've spent 47 years protecting them, keeping them safe from the Thorne family's reach. But I'm an old man now, and my mind isn't what it was. I forget things, important things. I may have already forgotten to do something crucial by the time you read this. There's something you need to know about the person who bought my property. I didn't choose you randomly, Ramon Salazar. I've been watching you for 6 months, learning about you, your character, your struggles. I know about your late wife, Sylvia, and I know something about her that she never knew herself. Sylvia was Preston Thorne Sr.'s daughter." Ramon stopped reading, the words blurring before his eyes. Sterling was watching him carefully. "Keep reading," the lawyer said quietly. Ramon's voice was hoarse as he continued. "Preston Thorne had an affair in 1985 with a woman named Teresa Ruiz. When she became pregnant, he paid her to disappear, to never contact him or claim any connection. Teresa raised Sylvia alone, never telling her daughter the truth about her father. I discovered this connection while investigating the Thorne family over the years. I've kept documentation, birth certificates, payment records, DNA evidence I obtained through means I won't detail here. This makes your son, Paolo, Preston Thorne's biological great-grandson. While Preston Sr. is dead, his son, Preston Jr., has no legitimate heirs. The Thorne estate, by rights, should be divided among all of Preston Sr.'s descendants, including Paolo. I chose you, Ramon, because you have a moral claim to the truth. Your wife deserved to know her real father, even if he was a monster. Your son deserves his inheritance not from theft, but from law. And most importantly, I believe you're the kind of man who will do what's right, even when it's dangerous. I've left evidence in Safety Deposit Box 347 at Hartsville Savings and Trust. The key is hidden on the property, in the barn's loft, inside an old coffee can that sits on the rafter above the northwest window. Inside that box, you'll find everything. Documentation of Preston Sr.'s crimes, including the murder Constance witnessed. Records of Preston Jr.'s illegal activities over the past 20 years. Financial crimes, intimidation, possibly involvement in at least 2 deaths that were ruled accidental. Use this information to protect Constance and Vincent. Use it to claim what's rightfully Paolo's. Use it to finally bring the Thornes to justice. I'm sorry I couldn't finish this myself. I'm sorry I had to burden you with it. But I've run out of time, and they've run out of options. Please, don't let my sister and nephew spend what's left of their lives in hiding. Give them the freedom they deserve. With hope and gratitude, Hadley Crane Ramon set down the letter, his mind reeling. Sylvia was a thorn. Paolo was a thorn. Everything Hadley had done, selling him the property, the impossibly low price, the warning about the barn, it had all been orchestrated. You knew about this, Ramon said to Sterling. It wasn't a question. I knew Hadley had plans, yes. But he didn't tell me the details until last month, and by then his mind was... Sterling paused. He made me promise not to reveal any of this unless the conditions were met. I've honored that promise. My wife's father murdered people. My son's great-grandfather was a killer. Your wife was a good woman who had nothing to do with Preston Thorne's crimes, Sterling said firmly. And your son is an innocent child. Blood doesn't determine character, Mr. Salazar. Actions do. Ramon thought about Sylvia, kind, gentle Sylvia who'd volunteered at the food bank and sang in the church choir, who'd loved fiercely and laughed often and never hurt anyone. She'd been nothing like the Thornes. What do I do with this? He asked, holding up the letter, what Hadley hoped you would. Find the key, retrieve the evidence, and use it to protect Constance and Vincent. And perhaps, Sterling hesitated, perhaps claim what's rightfully your son's inheritance. That evening, Ramon returned to Judith's house. Constance, Vincent, and Judith sat in the living room, their faces expectant and anxious. Ramon told them everything. About the letter, about Sylvia's true parentage, about Paolo's connection to the Thorne family. About the evidence waiting in the safety deposit box. Constance's face went pale. Your wife was Preston's daughter? No, she never knew. Her mother never told her. And Paolo, Constance looked toward the kitchen where Paolo sat doing homework at the table, oblivious to the conversation in the next room. That sweet boy is Thorne blood. He's my son, Ramon said firmly. And he's nothing like them. Vincent spoke up, his voice thoughtful. Neither was your wife, it sounds like. Being related to terrible people doesn't make you terrible. He looked at his mother. Isn't that what you always told me? That I wasn't defined by what happened to us, by the life we were forced to live. Constance's eyes filled with tears. She reached over and squeezed her son's hand. So we find this evidence, Judith said, practical as always. Then what? Then we decide how to use it, Ramon replied. But first we need to get it. The next morning, Ramon went to the barn. In daylight, with the doors open wide and Paolo at school, the space felt less ominous. He climbed the ladder to the loft, dust motes dancing in the sunlight that streamed through gaps in the wood. The loft was filled with old furniture, boxes of papers, and farm equipment that hadn't been used in decades. Ramon made his way carefully across the creaking boards to the northwest window. Above it, on the rafter, sat an old metal coffee can, exactly as Hadley had described. Ramon reached up and pulled it down. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a small brass key. A tag attached to it read, Box 347, Hartsville Savings and Trust. He held the key in his palm, feeling its weight. This small piece of metal represented decades of secrets, evidence that could destroy a powerful family, evidence that could finally free Constance and Vincent, but it also represented danger. The moment they accessed that box, the moment they moved against the thorns, they would become targets. All of them, including Paolo. Ramon thought about Hadley's letter, about being chosen because of his character, about doing what was right even when it was dangerous. He climbed down from the loft, the key secure in his pocket, and went to make a phone call. 2 days later, Ramon and Judith drove to Hartsville. They decided not to bring Constance or Vincent. If something went wrong, if the Thorns somehow found out, it was better that they remained hidden. The bank was a modest building on Hartsville's main street. Inside, a young woman at the desk looked up with a professional smile. "We need to access a safety deposit box," Ramon said. "Box 347, she checked her computer. "May I see identification and authorization?" Ramon presented his ID along with the letter from Sterling, notarized and official, explaining that, as the current owner of Hadley Crane's property, Ramon had legal access to Hadley's safety deposit boxes per the terms of the estate. The woman studied the documents carefully, made a phone call to verify, then nodded. "Follow me, please." She led them to a small room lined with metal boxes. She used the bank's master key along with Ramon's key to open box 347, then discreetly left them alone. Ramon pulled out the long metal drawer and set it on the table. Inside were folders, photographs, and a leather-bound ledger. Judith stood beside him as he began examining the contents. The first folder contained everything related to George Mason's murder. Photographs, grainy and distant but clear enough, showing Preston Thorne Sr. standing over a body. Copies of the coroner's report with handwritten notes in the margins pointing out inconsistencies. Financial records, showing large payments made by Preston to the sheriff and coroner in the weeks following Mason's death. The second folder documented Constance's husband's accident, photographs of the car, with close-ups of the brake lines that showed clear signs of tampering. A sworn statement from a mechanic who'd examined the vehicle and refused to sign off on the accident report, then mysteriously left town 2 weeks later. The third folder was about Preston Thorne Jr. It contained years of documented crimes, money laundering through his various businesses, intimidation of local officials, payoffs to keep investigations from moving forward, and most damning evidence connecting him to 2 deaths in 2012 and 2018, both ruled accidental, but both involving people who'd challenged Thorne business interests. The leather ledger was a detailed record Hadley had kept, cross-referencing events, dates, witnesses, and documentation. It was meticulous, thorough, and devastating. "This is enough," Judith whispered. "This is more than enough to bring them down." Ramon pulled out his phone and began photographing every page, every document, every photograph. It took nearly an hour. When he finished, he had hundreds of images stored in his phone and backed up to a cloud account. They returned everything to the box, locked it, and left the bank. As they walked to Ramon's truck, Judith grabbed his arm. "That truck across the street, the black one. It's been parked there since we arrived." Ramon looked. A black pickup with tinted windows, engine off, but someone clearly sitting in the driver's seat. "Maybe it's nothing," he said. But his hand moved to his phone, checking that the backup had completed. They drove out of Hartsville, and the black truck followed. "They know," Judith said, her voice tight with fear. "Somehow they know." Ramon kept his speed steady, not too fast, not too slow. The black truck maintained its distance, staying 3 cars back, but never losing sight of them. "What do we do?" Judith's knuckles were white where she gripped the door handle. "We don't lead them back to your house. That's where Constance and Vincent are." Ramon's mind raced through options. "We need to lose them, or—" He glanced at his phone in the cup holder. "Or we need witnesses. He took a turn that would lead them back toward Millerton, but along the main highway rather than the back roads they'd planned to use. More traffic, more people, more cameras. The black truck followed. As they entered Millerton, Ramon pulled into the parking lot of the diner on Main Street. It was lunchtime and the lot was full. He parked directly in front of the large windows where dozens of people could see them. The black truck drove past slowly, then continued down the street. But Ramon saw it turn at the next corner, circling around. "Come on." He got out, Judith following. They went into the diner and took a booth by the window. Ramon positioned himself where he could watch the street. The truck appeared again, parking across the street in front of the hardware store. "No one got out, they're just watching now," Judith said, "letting us know they're there." "Good, let them watch." Ramon pulled out his phone and called Sterling. When the lawyer answered, Ramon spoke quickly. "We got the evidence, all of it, but we're being followed." Black pickup, tinted windows. "They're parked across from the diner right now." "Don't go home," Sterling said immediately. "Don't go anywhere private. Stay in public places." "I'm calling a friend at the state police. Someone I trust who isn't connected to the Thorns." "How long until they can get here?" "An hour, maybe 2. Can you stay safe that long?" Ramon looked at the truck, at the dark windshield hiding whoever sat inside. "We'll have to." They ordered coffee and sandwiches they didn't want, making a show of eating slowly, killing time. Other diners came and went. The waitress, a woman named Dolly, who'd worked there for 30 years, chatted with them about the weather and the upcoming county fair. Through it all, the black truck waited. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. Ramon's phone buzzed with a text from Sterling, 15 minutes out. "State investigator named Alice Brenneman. Trust her." Ramon showed Judith the text. She nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Then the truck's door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his 50s, well-dressed in expensive casual clothes. Designer jeans, a polo shirt, leather jacket. He had the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms, handsome and assured. He looked both ways before crossing the street, then walked directly toward the diner. "That's Preston Thorne, Jr., Judith whispered. "I've seen his picture in the paper." Ramon's heart hammered as Thorne entered the diner. The man's eyes swept the room, landing on their booth. He smiled, a warm, friendly expression that didn't reach his eyes, and walked over. "Mr. Salazar, isn't it? And Mrs. Fairholme, may I join you?" Without waiting for an answer, he slid into the booth beside Judith, effectively trapping her against the window. Up close, Ramon could see the calculation behind Thorne's pleasant facade. This was a man used to getting what he wanted, used to being the most powerful person in any room. "I don't believe we've met," Ramon said carefully. "Preston Thorne." He extended his hand across the table. Ramon didn't take it. After a moment, Thorne withdrew it with a slight shrug. "I understand you've been asking questions about my family, about my father, just researching local history. In Hartsville? At a bank?" Thorne's smile never wavered. "I have friends there. They let me know when someone accesses certain sensitive accounts, so that was how he'd known." Ramon kept his expression neutral. "My father was a complicated man," Thorne continued. "He made mistakes. Anyone who's been successful in business has enemies, has stories told about them. Not all of those stories are true. Some of them are, though." Thorne's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "The past is the past, Mr. Salazar. Ancient history. There's no point in dredging it up now. It only causes pain, reopens old wounds. Wouldn't you agree, Judith?" Judith's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "The truth doesn't have an expiration date, Preston." "The truth." Thorne leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "The truth is that my father built this community. The businesses he started employ half the county. The hospital wing he funded saves lives. The school he renovated educates children. That's his legacy. Not some allegations from decades ago." "Allegations," Ramon repeated. "Is that what you call murder?" The word hung in the air. Around them, the diner continued its normal lunch rush, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in the corner booth. Thorne's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold beneath. Then it was back, smooth as ever. "You have a son, don't you, Mr. Salazar? Paolo, I believe, 8 years old. Sweet kid, the threat was barely veiled." Ramon's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "I'm not threatening the boy," Thorne said quickly, reading Ramon's expression. "I would never harm a child. I'm simply pointing out that you have responsibilities, people who depend on you. You've already been through so much, losing your wife, starting over in a new place. It would be a shame if more hardship came your way. You're saying I should walk away. Forget what I found. I'm saying that the past is complicated, that my father's alleged crimes, if they even happened, were nearly 50 years ago. The people involved are dead or—" He paused. "Well, dead. There's no one left to testify, no case to be made. All you have are old papers and speculation. There are always witnesses," Judith said quietly. "People who remember." Thorne looked at her, and something passed between them, some recognition or understanding that Ramon couldn't quite read. If such people existed, they'd have come forward long ago. The fact that they didn't suggests either they don't exist, or they chose silence for good reason. Or they were afraid, Ramon said. "Afraid of men like your father. Like you. I'm a businessman, Mr. Salazar, not a monster. I've never hurt anyone." Thorne pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, sliding it across the table. "If you're having financial difficulties, and I understand you bought the Crane property for very little, suggesting funds are tight, perhaps I could help. I'm always looking for reliable people to work for my companies. I pay well, very well." It was a bribe, barely disguised as a job offer. "I'm not interested," Ramon said. Thorne left the card on the table. "Think about it. Think about your son and what kind of future you want to provide for him. Sometimes the smart choice isn't the heroic one, it's the practical one." He slid out of the booth, standing. "Enjoy your lunch. And Mr. Salazar, be careful on those country roads. They can be dangerous, especially at night." He walked out of the diner, climbed back into his truck and drove away. Ramon's hands were shaking. Judith put her hand over his. "He threatened Paulo," Ramon said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He threatened all of us." Judith looked out the window at the now empty space where the truck had been. "But he's also worried. If he wasn't, he wouldn't have shown his face, wouldn't have tried to buy you off. He knows we have something that could hurt him." 10 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up to the diner. A woman in her 40s stepped out, dressed in plain clothes, but with a bearing that suggested law enforcement. She had short, dark hair and sharp, observant eyes that scanned the street before she entered. She spotted them immediately and came to their booth. "Mr. Salazar? Mrs. Fairholme? I'm Investigator Alice Brenneman, State Police." She showed her badge. "Bernard Sterling called me. He said you might need assistance." Ramon had never been so relieved to see a badge in his life. "Preston Thorne was just here. He followed us from Hartsville, confronted us, made threats." Brenneman's expression hardened. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, in a private room at the police station in Millerton, the state police had a small satellite office there. Ramon and Judith told Investigator Brenneman the whole story. About Constance and Vincent, about the barn, about Hadley's evidence, about the confrontation with Thorne. Ramon showed her the photographs on his phone, hundreds of pages of documentation. Brenneman studied each one carefully, her expression growing grimmer. "This is substantial," she said finally. "If even half of this is verifiable, we have multiple cases. Murder, conspiracy, witness tampering, financial crimes." She looked up at Ramon. "You understand, this is going to get complicated. The Thornes have resources, high-powered lawyers. This won't be quick or easy, I understand. But Constance and Vincent, they've been hiding for 47 years. They deserve justice. They deserve to finally live without fear. Where are they now? Safe. Hidden. I can arrange a meeting, but you don't fully trust me yet," Brenneman finished. "Smart. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Salazar. The Thornes do have connections in local law enforcement. Not in the state police, not in my division, but in the county level. If this investigation is going to work, we need to keep it quiet until we're ready to move. No leaks, no advance warning. What do you need from us?" "Everything you have. Full copies of all the documents. Statements from Constance Brenner about what she witnessed. Medical records showing the condition you found them in that supports the claim they were being held, even if inadvertently. She paused. "And I need to know about your wife's connection to Preston Thorne Sr." Ramon had almost forgotten about that part. Sylvia was his daughter, from an affair. She never knew, but you can prove it? Hadley had documentation. It's in the evidence, Brenneman nodded slowly. That changes things. Your son is a direct descendant, potentially entitled to a portion of the estate. That gives you legal standing, leverage. The Thorns won't be able to dismiss you as easily as they might an outsider poking into old business. I don't care about the money, Ramon said. I care about keeping my son safe. And helping Constance and Vincent, I understand. But the legal claim matters. It means you can't be intimidated away. She stood. Go home. Keep Constance and Vincent hidden and safe. Don't talk to anyone about this except me or Sterling. I'm going to start building a formal case. This is going to take some time, but we'll do it right. And Mr. Salazar, if Preston Thorne or anyone associated with him approaches you again, you call me immediately. She gave them her card, with a direct number written on the back, as Ramon and Judith drove home, taking a deliberately circuitous route to make sure they weren't followed. Ramon felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, the awareness of danger. But beneath it was something else, purpose, determination, the sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. He thought about Hadley Crane's letter, about being chosen for his character, about the responsibility that came with knowing the truth. The barn had stayed locked for 47 years, but now it was open, and everything it had contained, the secrets, the people, the evidence, was finally coming into the light. There would be no going back now. The only way forward was through. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo of tension and waiting. Ramon continued working at the lumberyard, kept Paulo's routine as normal as possible, and tried not to jump every time a car drove slowly past the farm. But the awareness of being watched never left him. Constance and Vincent remained at Judith's house, rarely venturing outside. Ramon visited them most evenings after work, bringing updates from investigator Brenneman, who was methodically building her case. Vincent was changing, Ramon noticed. Each day brought new discoveries, as the man experienced things most people took for granted. The first time he used a smartphone, his hands had trembled with wonder. The first time he ordered food at a restaurant, Judith had taken him to a quiet diner in the next county. He'd been overwhelmed by the choices, nearly breaking down when the waitress had simply smiled and recommended her favorite dish. 40 years, Vincent had said to Ramon one evening, sitting on Judith's back porch while the sun set. 40 years I've been alive but not living. I've read hundreds of books, but I've never been to a movie theater. I know the history of the world, but never walked down a city street. I can recite poetry, but I've never held someone's hand who wasn't my mother. The loss in his voice was profound, and Ramon had no words adequate to address it. Constance, meanwhile, had grown quieter, more withdrawn. The weight of finally confronting the past after so long seemed to be catching up with her. She'd given several statements to Brenneman, reliving the night she'd witnessed George Mason's murder, describing the years of hiding, the fear that had defined half her life. I keep thinking about my husband, she'd told Ramon, about how he died because of me, because of what I saw. I keep wondering if hiding was the right choice, or if I should have just... She'd broken off, unable to finish. You kept yourself and Vincent alive, Ramon had said. That's what matters. But he could see the guilt and grief in her eyes, the questions that had no good answers. On a Tuesday afternoon, Ramon came home from work to find Sterling's car parked in his driveway. The lawyer sat on the porch steps, his expression grave. "We need to talk," Sterling said. Inside, over coffee, Sterling laid out the situation. Investigator Brenneman has been thorough. She's verified most of Hadley's evidence, interviewed witnesses, built connections between the old crimes and Preston Jr.'s current activities. She believes she has enough to move forward. That's good, isn't it? It would be, except... Sterling paused. Preston Thorne has hired one of the best defense attorneys in the state, and he's filed a preemptive lawsuit against you, Constance and Vincent. Ramon set down his coffee cup. For what? Defamation, conspiracy, extortion. He's claiming that you fabricated evidence against him and his father as part of a scheme to extort money from the family. He's alleging that Constance and Vincent aren't who they claim to be, that they're imposters working with you to perpetrate a fraud. That's insane. We have documentation, medical records, I know, and ultimately his lawsuit won't stand. But it accomplishes several things. Sterling ticked them off on his fingers. It muddies the waters, makes the criminal investigation look like a civil dispute. It ties up resources. You'll need to respond legally, which costs time and money. And most importantly, it sends a message to anyone else who might come forward. The Thorns fight back and they fight dirty. What do? We proceed carefully. Brenneman wants to move forward with arrests within the next week. But she needs Constance to testify before a grand jury. And she needs to formally establish Vincent's identity, DNA testing, comparison to childhood medical records, expert testimony about the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Vincent's been through enough. Now we're asking him to be examined like some kind of specimen. I know it's not fair, but it's necessary to build an airtight case. Sterling leaned forward. Ramon, the Thorns are going to use every resource they have to discredit your witnesses and make this go away. We need to be absolutely certain of every fact, every piece of evidence. One mistake, one inconsistency, and a defense attorney will tear it apart. That evening, Ramon drove to Judith's house for a meeting that had become necessary. Brenneman was there, along with Sterling, Constance, Vincent, and Judith. They gathered around the dining room table like a war council, which in a way they were. Brenneman laid out the timeline. The grand jury convenes next Monday. Constance, I need you to testify about what you witnessed in 1978. We'll also present the physical evidence, the documents, photographs, financial records. If the grand jury returns an indictment, we can arrest Preston Thorne Jr. on conspiracy charges related to his father's crimes and his own subsequent cover-up and intimidation. What about the murders? Constance asked. George Mason, my husband, the others? Those cases will be harder. The statute of limitations for murder doesn't expire, but proving Preston Jr.'s direct involvement in his father's crimes is challenging. We can get him on obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and his own financial crimes. The historical murders will be documented, but Brenneman's expression was apologetic. Justice isn't always perfect. We work with what we can prove in court. So my husband's death might never be formally acknowledged as murder, Constance said quietly. I'm sorry. But we'll make sure the truth is on record, even if we can't secure a conviction on that specific charge. Vincent had been silent throughout the meeting, but now he spoke up. What happens to us? After the trial, after all of this? That depends on what you want, Brenneman said. We can work with social services to establish your legal identities. Vincent, you'll need a birth certificate, social security number, all the basic documentation of existence. It will take time, but it's doable, and we'll just live. Like normal people? As normal as you want. You'll need counseling, support, job training. Vincent, you've essentially been frozen in time since you were 7. Reintegrating into society won't be easy. But it will be possible, Judith added. You won't be alone. We'll help you. Vincent looked at his mother, and something passed between them, a lifetime of unspoken understanding. Constance nodded slowly. We'll testify, she said. We'll do whatever it takes. The weekend before the grand jury testimony, Ramon took Paulo fishing at the creek that ran through their property. The boy had been quiet lately, sensing the adult tension, even if he didn't fully understand it. Ramon had tried to shield him from the details, but Paulo was perceptive. Dad, are we in trouble? Paulo asked as they sat on the creek bank, their lines dangling in the slow-moving water. No, mijo. But we're helping some people who are in trouble. And sometimes helping people is complicated. The people from the barn. Ramon had told Paulo only the basics. That Constance and Vincent had been hiding. That they needed help. Yes, why were they hiding? How did you explain murder and corruption to an 8-year-old? Bad people wanted to hurt them. So they hid to stay safe. For a long time. A very long time. Paolo was quiet for a moment, watching his bobber drift on the water. That must have been lonely. The simple observation struck Ramon with its truth. Yes, very lonely. I'm glad we found them. Paolo looked up at his father. You did the right thing, opening the barn. Even though you promised not to, Ramon pulled his son close. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking a promise. But you have to be very sure it's the right thing, and you have to be willing to accept the consequences. Are there bad consequences? Sometimes. But that doesn't mean you don't do it anyway. That night, after Paolo was asleep, Ramon stood at his bedroom window looking out at the barn. The doors stood open now, had been open every day since he'd broken the lock. The space inside had been cleaned out, the hidden apartment dismantled. Just an ordinary barn now, empty except for old equipment and memories, but it had changed everything. Opening those doors had set in motion events that couldn't be stopped, had revealed truths that demanded action. Ramon had given his word to keep it locked, but breaking that promise had been the most important thing he'd ever done. His phone buzzed with a text from Brenneman. Final preparations complete. Monday we move forward. Be ready. Ramon replied, We're ready. But as he lay in bed that night, sleep elusive, he wondered if anyone was ever truly ready for the kind of confrontation that was coming. The Thorns had held power in this county for 3 generations. They had money, lawyers, connections. They'd gotten away with murder for decades. What did Ramon's small group have against all that? The truth, he reminded himself. They had the truth, documented and undeniable. They had Constance's testimony, Hadley's evidence, medical records and financial crimes. They had right on their side. He thought about what Sterling had said weeks ago. Blood doesn't determine character, actions do. The Thorns had chosen to build their empire on violence and fear. Constance had chosen to protect her son at the cost of her own freedom. Hadley had chosen to sacrifice his life to keep them safe. And Ramon had chosen to help, even knowing the danger. Those choices defined who they were, not their bloodlines or their bank accounts or their power. Monday morning arrived cold and grey, rain threatening in heavy clouds. Ramon dropped Paolo at school, extracted a promise that the boy would stay with his friend's family that night, just in case. Then he drove to Hartsville, where the courthouse stood imposing and solemn. Constance and Vincent were already there, with Judith and Sterling. Brenneman met them at the entrance. The grand jury is ready. Constance, you'll be called first. Just tell the truth. Answer their questions honestly. Don't embellish, don't speculate. Just facts. She looked at the older woman with something like admiration. You've been waiting 47 years to tell this story. Today, people will finally listen. Constance's hand shook as she smoothed her dress, new clothes Judith had bought for her, the first new clothes she'd worn in decades. I'm frightened, I know. But you're also brave. You've always been brave. Brenneman squeezed her shoulder. Let's go make sure your courage wasn't for nothing. They entered the courthouse, passing through security, walking down marble corridors that echoed with their footsteps. At the grand jury room, Constance paused, looking back at Vincent. For your father, she said softly. For all the years we lost. For the life you should have had, Vincent nodded, unable to speak. Then Constance straightened her shoulders and walked through the doors. Ramon, Vincent, Judith and Sterling waited in the hallway outside. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Other cases were heard. Witnesses came and went. The normal machinery of justice grinding forward. Finally, after 3 hours, the doors opened. Constance emerged, her face streaked with tears, but her expression lighter somehow, unburdened. I told them everything, she said. Every detail I've carried for 47 years. They listened. They believed me. Brenneman came out behind her. The grand jury will deliberate. But based on their questions and reactions, I believe we'll have our indictment. How long? Sterling asked. Could be today, could be tomorrow. But soon. They went to a small cafe across from the courthouse to wait. The rain had started, drumming against the windows, turning the street outside into a blur of grey. Inside, they sat around a table, coffee growing cold in front of them, conversations sporadic and strained. Ramon's phone rang. The number was blocked, but something made him answer. Mr. Salazar. Preston Thorne's voice, smooth and cold. "I hear your friend is telling stories to a grand jury. Interesting choice. How did you—" "But of course Thorne had sources everywhere. I want you to understand something. This crusade of yours, it's going to fail. My lawyers are better than your investigators. My resources are deeper than your righteousness. And when this falls apart, and it will, you'll be left with nothing. Worse than nothing. You'll have made an enemy of the most powerful family in this county." "You're scared," Ramon said, and he heard the truth of it in his own words. "If you weren't, you wouldn't be calling. You wouldn't have threatened me at the diner. You'd just ignore us." A pause. "Then enjoy your moral victory while it lasts. Reality is going to be very different. The line went dead. That was Thorne," Ramon said to the others. "He knows about the testimony." "Of course he does," Sterling said. "But knowing doesn't help him now. The wheels are in motion." An hour later, Brenneman's phone rang. She answered, listened, then looked at the group with an expression Ramon couldn't quite read. The grand jury returned an indictment. Multiple counts: obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, conspiracy, and 3 counts of financial fraud. She stood. Preston Thorne Jr. is about to be arrested. Outside the cafe windows, through the rain, they could see police cars pulling up to a building down the street. Thorne Financial Services. Uniformed officers entered, and moments later emerged with Preston Thorne in handcuffs. Even from a distance, Ramon could see the fury on Thorne's face as he was placed in the back of a patrol car. "It's really happening," Constance whispered. "After all this time, it's really happening." Vincent took his mother's hand. Judith wiped tears from her eyes. Sterling allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Ramon watched the police car drive away, carrying Preston Thorne toward a justice that was decades overdue. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. But Ramon knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much longer battle. The arrest made the evening news. Ramon sat with Paolo on the couch, watching as reporters detailed the charges against Preston Thorne Jr. The story was sensational. A powerful businessman arrested on corruption charges connected to decades-old crimes. The broadcast showed footage of Thorne being led from his office, his expensive lawyer already at his side, proclaiming his client's innocence. But the arrest was only the beginning. Thorne posted bail within hours. A staggering amount that he paid without hesitation. By the next morning, his legal team had filed motions challenging every aspect of the case. They attacked the evidence as circumstantial, questioned Constance's credibility after so many years, demanded independent verification of Vincent's identity. "They're going to make this as difficult as possible," Brenneman told Ramon over the phone. "Thorne's attorneys are some of the best in the country. They'll drag this out, challenge every witness, every document. This could take months, maybe years. Will the charges stick?" "I believe so. But it's going to be a fight." The next blow came 2 days later. Ramon arrived home from work to find his truck's windshield shattered, a brick lying on the seat surrounded by broken glass. Spray-painted across his garage door were the words, "Leave town." He called Brenneman immediately. She sent local police to document it, but everyone knew who was behind it. Not Thorne himself, he was too smart for that, but someone in his employ. Someone sending a message. That night, Ramon couldn't sleep. He kept checking the windows, listening for any sound that seemed out of place. Every car that passed on the distant road made his heart race. He thought about Paolo, asleep upstairs, innocent and unaware of the real danger they were in. Had he made a terrible mistake? Should he have kept the barn locked, honored his promise to Hadley, left Constance and Vincent to whatever fate awaited them? But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew the answer. No, some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was terrifying. The harassment continued. Someone slashed the tires on Judith's car. A brick was thrown through Sterling's office window. Constance received anonymous letters at Judith's house, vicious, threatening letters that promised violence if she testified at trial. Brenneman arranged protection. Patrol cars driving past their homes, regular check-ins, direct lines to call for help. But the fear remained. a constant weight pressing down on all of them. Then 3 weeks after the arrest, Vincent disappeared. Judith called Ramon at work, her voice shaking.
He's gone.
I went to wake him this morning, and his room was empty. His bed hadn't been slept in. There's no note, no sign of a struggle, just gone. Ramon's blood ran cold. Call Brenneman, now. I'm on my way. He drove to Judith's house faster than he should have, his mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. The Thorns had taken Vincent, were holding him hostage, had already... No. He couldn't think like that. Brenneman was already there when he arrived, along with 2 other investigators. They were examining Vincent's room, looking for any clue about where he might have gone. Constance sat in the living room, her face grey with terror. They took him. The Thorns took my son. We don't know that yet, Brenneman said, but her expression was grim. There's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. It's possible he left on his own. Why would he do that? Judith asked. Ramon thought about Vincent's face the day before, when another threatening letter had arrived. The way his expression had shuttered, become distant. He's trying to protect us. He thinks if he's gone, if he's not here to testify, the Thorns will leave the rest of us alone. That's ridiculous, Constance said. We're already too deep in this. His leaving won't... She broke off, realization dawning. He doesn't understand how the outside world works. He's spent 40 years in hiding. He thinks like someone who's been hunted his whole life. Brenneman pulled out her phone. I'll issue an alert. We'll find him. But where did you look for a man who'd spent his entire adult life learning how to hide? Ramon stood in Vincent's room, looking at the few possessions he'd accumulated. Books, clothes, a journal where he'd been recording his thoughts about the outside world. On the nightstand was a photograph of him and Constance taken just last week. They were smiling, standing in Judith's backyard in the sunlight. Beside the photograph was a note written in Vincent's careful handwriting. I'm sorry. I can't let them hurt you because of me. I've lived in cages before. I can do it again if I have to. But I won't let them hurt my mother or the people who saved us. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm finally doing something brave. Veramon handed the note to Brenneman. She read it, her jaw tightening. He's not running away. He's going to confront Thorn himself. He'll get himself killed, Constance whispered. No. Ramon was already moving toward the door. Not if we find him first. But even as he said it, he wondered if they were already too late. They found Vincent's trail within an hour. A gas station attendant remembered him. A nervous man asking for directions to the Thorn estate. He'd been on foot, walking along the highway toward the north side of the county, where the Thorn family compound sat on 200 acres of prime land. Ramon. Brenneman and 2 state police officers drove in pursuit. Constance had wanted to come, but Brenneman had convinced her to stay with Judith, where she'd be safe. What's he planning to do? One of the officers asked as they sped down the country roads. I don't know, Ramon said. But he spent 40 years being a victim. Maybe he's tired of it. The Thorn estate came into view, a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured grounds, iron gates, and security cameras. Brenneman pulled up to the gate just as a black SUV was leaving. Through the window, Ramon glimpsed Vincent in the back seat, flanked by 2 large men. That's him, Ramon said. Brenneman hit the lights and siren, pulling the SUV over. The vehicle stopped, and the men inside didn't resist as Brenneman and the officers approached with hands on their weapons. Vincent stumbled out, looking shaken but unharmed. Relief flooded through Ramon. Are you hurt? Brenneman demanded. No, they were actually bringing me home. Mr. Thorn talked to me and then he said to take me back to Judith's. Brenneman turned to the driver. Is Preston Thorn at the house? Yes, ma'am. He's expecting you, actually. Said you'd probably show up. The man handed her a card. He asked me to give you this. Brenneman read it, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Ramon. He wants to talk. Says he has a proposal. It's a trap, one of the officers said. Maybe, but I want to hear what he has to say. She looked at Vincent. What happened in there? Vincent's voice was quiet. I walked up to the gate, told the security guard I wanted to see Preston Thorn. I don't know what I thought. That I could convince him to leave everyone alone, maybe. That I could trade myself for their safety. He shook his head. I was stupid. I don't understand how any of this works. You were brave, Ramon said. Reckless, but brave. Mr. Thorne met with me in his study. He poured me a drink. I'd never had whiskey before, and he talked. He told me about his father, about how much pressure there was to live up to that legacy, how he'd spent his whole life trying to prove he was as strong, as powerful. He said, Vincent paused. He said he was tired, that maybe it was time for the truth to come out. Brenneman's eyes narrowed. He said that. He said he'd make a deal. If we agreed to certain terms, he'd cooperate, give testimony about his father's crimes, admit to the cover-up. But he wants guarantees. What kind of guarantees? Reduced charges. No jail time for him, just house arrest and probation. Financial penalties, but not complete ruin. And Vincent looked at Ramon. He wants to meet Paolo, his great-nephew. He said he never had children, never had family beyond his parents. He wants to know the boy exists. Ramon's protective instincts flared. No, absolutely not. I'm not asking you to agree, Vincent said quickly. I'm just telling you what he said. Brenneman made a decision. Officer Mendez, take Vincent back to the Fairholme residence. Mr. Salazar, you're with me. We're going to talk to Preston Thorne. The estate's interior was as impressive as the exterior. Marble floors, expensive art, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Preston Thorne waited in a library that looked like something from a movie, surrounded by leather-bound books and oak paneling. He stood as they entered, and Ramon was struck by how tired he looked. The confidence from their last meeting had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. Investigator Brenneman, Mr. Salazar. Thank you for coming. He gestured to chairs. Please sit. I'll stand, Brenneman said. You wanted to talk. Talk. Thorne poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly. I've spent my whole life protecting my father's legacy, building on what he created, defending his reputation. But the truth is, my father was a monster. I knew it. I always knew it. Then why cover for him? Ramon asked. Because he was my father. Because everything I have came from him. Because, Thorne's voice broke, because I was afraid that if the truth came out, I'd lose everything. My name, my business, my place in this community. I'd be the son of a murderer instead of the heir to an empire. You intimidated witnesses, Brenneman said. You continued your father's crimes. I know, and I'll face consequences for that. But I want to control how this ends. I want to tell the truth on my terms, not have it dragged out of me piece by piece in court. He looked at Ramon. I want to meet my great-nephew. I want him to know that not everyone in the Thorne family is what my father was. He's 8 years old, Ramon said. He doesn't need to know any of this. He will eventually. Children grow up. They ask questions. Better he hears the truth from someone who can explain it than discovers it later, twisted by rumor and speculation. Brenneman pulled out her phone, stepping aside to make a call. Ramon could hear her talking to someone, probably the district attorney, in low, urgent tones. She returned 5 minutes later. Here's what we can offer. You provide full testimony about your father's crimes and your own involvement in the cover-up. You cooperate completely with the investigation. In exchange, we'll recommend reduced charges. No murder charges against you personally, but obstruction and conspiracy charges stand. You'll serve time, but we'll argue for a lighter sentence given your cooperation. How much time? Probably 3 to 5 years minimum. No guarantees, Thorne considered this. And the meeting with Paolo? That's not my decision, Brenneman said. That's his father's choice. Both of them looked at Ramon. He thought about Paolo, about the life he'd tried to build for his son, far from violence and corruption. About Sylvia, who'd never known her real father. About the weight of family legacy and the possibility of redemption. If, and this is a big if, I ever allow that meeting, it won't be now. It won't be while any of this is ongoing. Maybe someday, when he's older, when he can understand the full context. But not as a condition of your testimony. Thorne's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. Fair enough. I'll take the deal. Brenneman pulled out paperwork she'd apparently prepared in advance, always thinking ahead. Thorne signed, his signature shaky but clear. As they prepared to leave, Thorne spoke once more. Mr. Salazar, Tell Paulo when the time comes, if it ever does. Tell him that his great-grandfather was a criminal, but he was also human. Flawed and terrible, but human. And that people can choose to be better than their blood. Tell him I tried at the end to be better than mine. Ramon didn't respond. He simply walked out, Brenneman beside him, leaving Preston Thorne alone in his library with his expensive whiskey and the weight of 3 generations of sins finally coming due. 6 months later, autumn painted the farm in shades of gold and amber. Ramon stood on the porch, coffee warming his hands, watching the morning mist lift from the fields. The barn doors stood open, as they had every day since he'd broken that rusted lock. Inside, it was just a barn now, hay bales, tools, the ordinary contents of ordinary life. So much had changed. Preston Thorne Jr. had kept his word. His testimony before the court had been thorough and damning, not just about his father's crimes, but his own. The trial had made national news, a corruption case that stretched back decades, revealing how one family's violence had shaped an entire county. Thorne was sentenced to 4 years in prison, eligible for parole in 3. His business empire was dismantled, assets seized, the Thorne name no longer synonymous with power, but with cautionary tales about justice delayed. The charges had extended beyond Preston. 3 local officials were indicted for accepting bribes. The former sheriff, long retired, faced prosecution for his role in covering up George Mason's murder. The whole rotten structure that the Thornes had built came crashing down, and in its wake, Millerton was learning to rebuild. Constance had testified at the trial, her voice steady as she recounted that night in 1978, when she'd witnessed a murder that had stolen her life. The jury had listened with rapt attention, and when she finished, several of them were wiping their eyes. Justice for George Mason, for her husband, for all the years stolen. It couldn't undo the past, but it acknowledged it. That mattered. Vincent was still adjusting to freedom, but he was trying. He'd gotten his GED, was taking community college classes online. He'd found work at the Millerton Library, shelving books and helping with computer training for seniors, a job that let him share his love of learning while working at his own pace. He still struggled in crowds, still had moments of panic when he felt confined, but he was healing. Slowly, carefully, healing. He'd also started writing a memoir about his 47 years in the barn. A publisher had shown interest, seeing in his story something both tragic and hopeful. The chance to reclaim his narrative, to transform his stolen life into something meaningful. And he'd made a friend. Mrs. Dolly from the diner had a grandson, Kevin, who shared Vincent's love of science fiction. They met weekly to discuss books, and gradually Vincent was learning what it meant to have relationships beyond family, beyond necessity. It was a small thing, but watching Vincent laugh at something Kevin said, Ramon saw glimpses of the man he might have been if life had been kinder. Constance had moved into a small house in town, finally having a place that was truly hers. She volunteered at the school where she'd once taught, working with children who needed extra help with reading. Some of her former colleagues remembered her, wept at her return from the dead, embraced her as if 47 years had been 47 days. She was building a life. Piece by careful piece. As for Ramon and Paulo, they'd stayed at the farm. The property that had cost Ramon everything had given him something far more valuable: purpose, community, and the knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. The lumberyard had promoted him to supervisor. He'd repaired the house room by room, planted a garden that actually grew food, learned the rhythms of rural life. Paulo thrived. The boy had friends at school, played baseball in the summer league, was growing tall and confident. He knew some of what had happened. Ramon had explained it in age-appropriate terms. But for Paulo, the story was simple. His dad had helped people who needed help. That was enough. The inheritance question had been settled through the courts. Paulo was confirmed as Preston Thorne Sr.'s great-grandson, entitled to a portion of the estate. The money was placed in a trust for his education and future, not the full Thorne fortune, but enough to give him opportunities. enough to ensure that poverty would never force him into desperate choices. Ramon had used some of the settlement money to build a small cottage on the south edge of the property. It sat empty now, waiting, but he'd told Constance and Vincent it was theirs if they ever wanted to be closer to the land that had sheltered them for so long. Constance had declined. She needed space from the barn, from those memories, but Vincent sometimes visited, sitting on the cottage porch and staring at the horizon as if still amazed by the vast openness of the world. On this particular morning, as Ramon finished his coffee, a car pulled up the driveway. Judith, with Constance in the passenger seat and Vincent in the back. They'd made plans for Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition they'd started months ago. Paolo burst out of the house, running to greet them, and Vincent swung him up in a hug that would have been impossible 6 months ago, both the physical strength and the emotional openness to do it. Constance watched her son with tears in her eyes, the good kind. They gathered in the kitchen, preparing food together, the conversation easy and full of laughter. Judith told stories about the town council's latest drama. Vincent described a rare book that had come into the library. Constance shared news about one of her students, finally learning to read after months of struggle. Paolo demonstrated a magic trick Vincent had taught him, performing it with such earnest concentration that everyone applauded. As Ramon looked around the table at these people who'd become his family, chosen family, forged through crisis and courage, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. The barn that should have stayed locked, the promise he'd broken, the door he'd opened that had led to danger and truth and ultimately freedom. Sometimes, he reflected, the things we're told to keep locked away are exactly the things that need to see the light. Sometimes breaking a promise is an act of faith. Sometimes the fresh start we're seeking finds us instead, in the most unexpected ways. Through the window, he could see the barn standing solid against the autumn sky. Its doors open wide, no longer holding secrets. Just a barn on a farm where a man and his son had learned that home wasn't just a place. It was the people you chose to protect, the truths you chose to honor, the courage to open doors that others wanted to keep closed. And in the end, that was more than enough.